Dr. Ronald Dahl is a distinguished professor at UC Berkeley and is renowned for his research on adolescent brain development and its relevance to behavioral and emotional health. He is the founding director for the Center for the Developing Adolescent. He served for 12 years as the director of the Institute of Human Development at UC Berkeley and is past president of the Society for Research on Child Development. Dr. Dahl is a pediatrician and a developmental scientist who has led interdisciplinary research that has advanced understanding of the development of sleep and arousal regulation, emotional regulation, the development of emotional disorders in children and adolescents, and the clinical, public health, and policy implications of his work. His current work focuses on adolescence as a developmental period with unique opportunities, not only for early intervention for a wide range of behavioral and emotional health problems, but also to promote the healthy development and thriving. He is the host of the podcast Adaptivity, the Science of Adolescence.
I'm really honored to be part of this amazing event and group of people. And I'm gonna advance the slide because that is gonna contrast that I'm an old person now from when that picture was used. I am really looking forward to sharing my learning journey and some of the insights that our team has gained. And I want to say a few things about that. I think one is the range of things that were just described is not my work. It is teams and teams of teams. And I've been incredibly fortunate to be involved and connected with teams at multiple levels, from people that are clinicians, people that are interested in public health and policy, people interested in basic science work. And most of what I do is help make bridges across those levels. And I think a lot of the conversations here are really, at this space of bridges. And I feel like my goal for what I want to talk about has been made so much easier because Nikki did so much of the hard work of explaining the complexity in the science and then how the windows of insights can really inform practical issues. And I just really want to say that Adrienne's amazing clinical pearls sets up the most central set of ideas about relationships as the key to almost everything we do, including what's happening here. I want to share just a few sort of conceptual level issues. First an outline of what I'm going to try to cover, hopefully. I would do just a brief intro sharing some perspectives on resilience. And then I'm going to talk about really picking up on the theme that I think Nikki described brilliantly is how do we target developmental windows of opportunity, whether that's pregnancy, whether that's early childhood, whether that's starting transition into school for the first time or adolescence. And I'm going to focus most of that on adolescence, but it's a broader frame. It's not what is the most important time, is what are the most important things to do to match windows of opportunity. And I think that's so much of the art of taking the science and saying, how do we translate that into something practical? And that's the second point, which is it's not just getting all the details of the science correct and precise. It's what are the actionable insights that can guide early intervention and prevention to really alter some of these negative pathways that emerge, especially in adolescence, as we'll focus on. And then the third part, which is in some ways similar and yet some ways different, which isn't just how do we prevent or intervene early for negative problems, but how do we promote healthy development and thriving and flourishing and resilience, and tapping in not only to preventing the negative, but into the strong natural motivations young people want to contribute, they want to matter, they want to add value, and helping them do that is one of the most important things we can do for their health as well as for society. So resilience is a complex set of processes, and there's some debates and disagreements about how to define and operationalize resilience and how to promote resilience. And I want to, this little cartoon, in some ways I think there's this tendency to think that, well, we want to have more good things, successes and support and love and relationships and less of the bad things, as if we give a little more of the good things and a little less of the bad things, that we're going to actually promote resilience, like less feelings of struggle and more feelings of success and being valued and mattering. And I think that in some ways, rather than thinking about an additive balance, it is, oh, I missed a slide somehow. It is actually more of a yin and a yang interaction between struggles, overcoming difficulties, and feeling success despite those challenges. And I think that's really the framework I want to advocate for in this approach. I'm going to bring a framework, and it's not the term, but I think it's very well set up by Nikki's talk, of developmental science as an integrative understanding across several different disciplines, not just the developmental neuroscience, which is a passion of mine, and I think it's been exciting to see the progress, but certainly developmental psychology, the science of learning and fundamental learning processes, population health, social, clinical, and implementation science, policy, and even anthropological perspectives, how evolution shapes some of these adaptive systems. And it's really integrating across these different disciplines to address developmental insights. And I want to be using this framework of an integrative developmental science as the most valuable framework for what we're talking about. I also want to, when I think about resilience, I was very strongly influenced by a good friend and colleague, Ann Maston. We worked together in a research network for several years. And she wrote this beautiful book, Ordinary Magic, Resilience in Development, and it really integrated at the time, there's a second edition of the book out now, a lot of the evidence and I think interpreting what the evidence showed about what resilience is. And there are a few things I want to highlight from Ann's perspective. One was that there were myriad pathways to resilience, but she really noted that this typically emerges as the result of normal developmental processes, not extraordinary personal. It's not like heroically resilient people. It is really this configuration of normal processes that can tip a trajectory into a more positive, resilient pathway. And I think, and Nikki was tapping into this with a number of the studies, a factor that might be adaptive in one setting can be less adaptive in another setting. And that literally the quote is, almost any given factor, circumstance, or trait might be quite adaptive in one scenario or one environment and maladaptive in another. And then finally, and it gets to the point Adrian really illustrated beautifully in the Clinical Pearls, the crucial role of capacities to learn and adapt, whether that's gradually, whether that's transformationally, in the context of a caring, supportive relationship, especially at key intervals of time. Oh, and then maybe the slides are just in a slightly different order than I remembered. And this was the idea that resilience is not the absence of struggle or difficulties and setbacks. It appears to be based in the successful adaptive overcoming of these. And yes, we really, at the population level, policy level, we want to minimize the harms, traumas, and toxic stress that can cause so much suffering in the lives of, at various points of the life course, children, adolescents, particularly during these formative periods of learning and development. And we might do well to place at least equal, if not more, effort in promoting the positive. We are such a strong tendency to zoom in on the negative and the problems and try to solve the problems and minimize them and alter them, when promoting positive relationships, promoting uplifting moments, promoting the recognition of the good things may actually have a more powerful impact, even at the level of these neural systems. And that's the frame I want to really be remembering. So now we will shift to the problem frame for a bit. And so much of what we've learned about adolescence over the last 30 years has been through funding and research, because it's such a time of vulnerability. It's such a time of complex challenges. And by the fact, as highlighted, that the largest sources of disability in the world are from mental health problems. And about 75% of mental disorders begin by age 75, by age 25, I'm sorry. With 3/4 of, yes, yeah. because the early developmental roots, including risk factors starting prenatally, early childhood, transition to school, and during adolescence and the transition to adulthood. Lifetime disorders that are going to have morbidity and mortality across the lifespan are beginning by or during adolescence. And over the past decade, as everyone here I think is quite aware of, there have been escalating rates of emotional distress, loneliness, mental health problems among youth. And from a global perspective, these issues around adolescence are even more important because right now we have more adolescents than ever have been alive in the world, and the highest proportion of the world's population that are currently adolescents. And adolescents 90% of the adolescents in the world are living in low and middle income countries and dealing with amplified challenges in their lives in many ways. And so there's an entire generation of adolescents who are coming of age amidst rapidly changing and greater uncertainties. And when you think of the magnitude of these problems, the largest sources of morbidity and mortality, how many young people are being affected, how rapidly the world is changing and challenging young people, no single discipline or single system approach is going to solve this problem or have a huge impact on this problem. The medical system alone, public health alone, economic solutions, school-based or community support, each of those are incredibly important, and yet we need to think in more integrative ways how to have a larger impact. And it's not to say that the developmental science perspective is magic or adds a particularly large value, but it can provide insights for bringing together these different disciplines in a more integrated way. And this comes back to this idea of the integrative developmental science. And I want to unpack this by just using a very simple example to highlight that the life course, if we say it's all these different disciplines together, well, what makes it developmental science? And it's because we're looking at life course in ways that include developmental continuities, things that continuously change, and then discontinuities. And those point to underlying developmental processes. And understanding those processes, particularly pivotal inflection points on these developmental trajectories, provide actionable insights. They tell us about windows of vulnerability and windows of opportunity. I'm going to point this out by looking at something really simple, just physical growth. And basically, this is, boys and girls, this is not growth charts, this is growth velocity. So this is remeasuring kids over and over like that happens in a pediatrician's office. How many centimeters a year are they growing? And what you can see is in the first few years of life, kids are growing really, really fast, 13 to 15 centimeters per year. They continue to grow through childhood, but they're slowing down and it's starting to level off. And then something happens here about age 13 in boys on average, and at about 10 or 11 in girls on average. Suddenly, the growth rate accelerates like crazy. And then after doing that for a couple years, it pivots, slows down, and gradually decelerates until we stop growing at all. Now, why is this very simple, pattern relevant to what we're talking about today? Because if you think about the underlying developmental process, we know exactly what is causing rapid growth in these two periods of time. This is not being a certain age or starting school. This is puberty. This is the pubertal growth spurt. We know the hormones. We know the processes. And it's not that every 12-year-old, some kids will be starting earlier, some later. This is a set of processes that create vulnerability. We know from global population studies, if you are in this phase of the life course, when there's a war or a famine or some of the terrible things that are happening in the world, you're going to be stunted because your nutritional needs are twice as high when you're growing at this pace. If you're at this part of the life course, when these bad, terrible things happen, you're going to have a bigger impact on that measurable outcome, stunted growth. If you are going to supplement and provide support, you're going to get a bigger impact here and here because that's going to have an impact directly in that vulnerability. This provides mechanistic insights about what are the processes that create the opportunity and testable hypotheses about how to improve those trajectories. But what we're talking about with physical growth is not just an example of taking a developmental science perspective and turning it into clinical and policy implications. It's a metaphor for all of the other things like cognitive development, social development, emotional development. And this ability to understand developmental windows of vulnerability and opportunity and match interventions, supports, and policies to those windows, even though this is a very simple thing like height and physical growth, this is a metaphor for a lot of other complex systems we're trying to understand. This was a paper that was part of a series of studies that came out in Nature in 2018, recognizing that the science of adolescence is now it's only about 10 or 15 years behind the science of early child development, but increasingly we are recognizing that it's not only this neuroplasticity and sensitive learning in the first few years of life or in prenatal, but there's another window. And just like the rapid growth, and looking at things like hormones, these two windows share a number of features. There are neurobehavioral changes. Puberty initiates this period of rapid physical growth, but a whole set of dynamic changes in the brain. Increased sensation seeking, novelty seeking, a tendency to explore and try new things. Increased sensitivity to social evaluation and social value feedback. We all like positive feedback, and we all dislike being put down or criticized, but the intensity of those feelings are amplified as children move into adolescence. There are profound changes in sleep and circadian regulation, increased motivational salience for social dynamics, sensitivity to peers, status, prestige, the development of sexual and romantic interests. And these changes together create a new period of formative social learning. And when I say social learning, I mean trial and error, trying different things, failing, and learning from that as young people are developing their identities, as social identities as an individual and as a part of their group, and developing new kinds of social bonds and relationships. And there is a compelling case for investing in this window of time, not just for physical growth like height, but for these formative social learning experiences, just like there is for prenatal and for early childhood. So I want to unpack that a bit, but I want to make one other general point, which was, again, already nicely set up. This should say learning and brain development. I'm not sure exactly why it doesn't matter. What I want to highlight is that when we think of learning processes and we think of these changes in neural systems with brain development, they're inextricably intertwined. Every behavior and every set of experiences is shaping our brain and how those neurons are connecting. And as brain development occurs, that's going to shape how we process information. And in the first few years of life, we know that social interactions and development of social relationships are powerfully motivating, and the brain is expecting and wanting to learn these. But I want to emphasize this is about sending and receiving information. It is whether it's the serve and return metaphor or peekaboo metaphors, it is the sending and receiving of information and feelings. Feelings are real things. They are as biological as anything that we study. They then sound mushy, but when two individuals are sharing feelings in synchronized ways, these are powerful parts of how the brain gets organized. And the point, and it's probably not going to be a surprise, that this is a very important part in adolescence. And I want to just take a moment and underscore this theme that's, I think, emerging in terms of the family and the organization of the symposium, but also as Adrienne was talking about in terms of the importance of relationships, feelings of connection are not simply a sort of descriptive process. It is a fundamental human process that involves neural systems, not just within the individual, but between two individuals. You feel connected. You feel connected to your school. You feel connected to your community. You feel connected to people you care about. It is a set of sensations that are embodied and that are involving just as rigorously scientific neural systems as anything else that we study. And wanting those feelings of connection, feeling valued, mattering, is fundamental to healthy development. And even though these things can be harder to measure than cognitive processes and executive function, in terms of motivational systems and social learning, they are at least as powerful and as important. And these are shaped by authentic versions of this feeling, not similes or, having experiences that capture some features of authentic feelings may affect the brain quite differently. I'm going to come back to that later. But this set of issues around relationships, feelings of connection, feelings of being valued, and being valuable to others is fundamental to what we are increasingly understanding in terms of adolescence. And so back to this learning and brain development, there it is with the text. The learning and brain development inextricably intertwined that is so important in early child development is incredibly important as we move into adolescence. This picture is ironic because rather than two people staring into each other's eyes and reading each other's facial expression and pupil changes that happens, this is another way to interact with. They may be actually texting other friends, but this is a very different pattern. And it's not to blame technology. Technology can be an incredibly valuable tool for connection, but it's not activating the same processes when we send text messages and interact with screens as if that promotes in real life interactions. So there's a similar social relationship framework for understanding the developing brain in adolescence. And this is not just social learning at like observing something, taking it in and learning from it. It is really action outcome learning. A lot of the science of learning that is relevant to AI and machine learning, there's also been tremendous advances in understanding how the brain learns through action outcome learning. And we need to make mistakes. We need unexpected outcomes to adjust our behavior accordingly, and that includes challenges. Action outcome learning requires making mistakes, and mistakes are costly, painful, and uncomfortable to make, and yet those are essential parts, not only of being resilient, but becoming an adaptive, healthy human being. And so this, learning about self and other, and learning how not only to pursue our own goals, but understand the goals, wants, and needs of others, learning to cooperate and compete. There's always competition, and there's hierarchies, but most ways to be success often require cooperation and collaboration. And sociologist Rob Krosnow, who spent a good part of his career studying adolescence in the wild, in real school settings. I loved his one of the main books that he wrote from all these studies. He said, what adolescents really want to do is they want to fit in and stand out. And it's both of those, right? I mean, they are incredibly sensitive to social norms. They want to know how to fit in, but they also want to stand out. And that is true across cultures, and it's also true in hunter-gatherer societies. Wanting to stand out and to fit in. And this tension, this is dynamic, and wanting to belong, to matter, to contribute and connect. So I want to step back a little bit and start moving into some of the science and the clinical implications of this, why these learning processes are so important. This is a figure from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, the Promise of Adolescence report. I think it came out in 2019. And what I liked about their definition of adolescence is that on one hand, they are recognizing that it goes from 10 to 25. Some of these changes, childhood ends as some of these early pubertal changes begins. But of course, a 10-year-old is very different than a 25-year-old. We can't just say this is adolescence as if it's some block of time that we can understand and describe. This includes this transition from childhood into adolescence, early adolescence and middle adolescence, includes late adolescence and a set of changes and processes, and then the transition to adulthood, which is a social transition to having the roles and responsibilities of being an adult. I am going to talk today a lot about this window of time, because I think we're getting a lot of evidence and understanding of why some kinds of formative learning here is influencing trajectories here. These are incredibly important years for adolescent health and well-being, as we'll talk about. But this window may be providing a frontier for really high impact work. And I'm going to be unpacking that a bit. So, as we've said, these are huge, gnarly problems. If you look at morbidity and mortality in school ages and then follow it through into adolescence and adulthood, almost everything you can measure in physical health gets better, but overall morbidity and mortality gets worse. And it's not because of mysterious medical illnesses, it's because of difficulties with the control of behavior and emotions. Increasing rates of accidents, suicide, homicide, depression, alcohol and substance use, violence, reckless behaviors, eating disorders, sexually transmitted diseases, health problems related to risky behaviors in general, increasing rates of loneliness, emotional distress, obesity gets worse, and long-term impact on mental and physical health. And it's shaping the developing sense of self. So this set of problems that are really emerging in adolescence is something that we recognize. But I want to just unpack this a little bit more related to my earlier point. And that is, I'm just going to take an example of non-suicidal self-injury cutting. It's at very high rates that went up a lot during the pandemic. And I want to make 2 points here. One is, if you are an epidemiologist, or if you're a clinician, or if you're a policymaker worried about this problem, this is age, okay? So you say, okay, well, this is a problem we really need to think about from 15 to at least into the 40s, okay? That's when this problem is peaking. But if you're a developmental scientist, don't you want to look here when the rates go from 0 to the highest they're going to be in the lifespan? Okay, this is an inflection point. This suggests, yes, we need to treat people when they're suffering, but if we want to intervene early, this 10 to 14 looks like the action. And it's not just for this example. This is depression rates. This is actually disability and global measures of depression in females and males. These are all eating disorders in females. The males, there's different age peaks, there's different patterns, but the inflection point is pretty consistent. It starts up more. This is like a very old slide of the age crime curves. If you look at the worst things humans do, okay, peaks in early adulthood. This is where we see the problem. But where is the inflection point? Okay, so if we want to take a developmental science perspective, just like when we looked at physical growth, there is an inflection point that suggests we want to understand how to support the positive processes here before they turn into the much more difficult to treat issues. This is one last slide. This is actually looking as a relatively recent evidence of global burden of disease across the world. And it's fascinating, and again, how much of the global burden of disease and disability is in mental disorders. But if you look at age brackets, depression is the darker red, and anxiety is the pinkish red. And if you look at 5 to 9-year-olds, anxiety is like the 8th highest source of problem, and depression's down here at 40th. But by 10 to 14, anxiety is 4th, and depression is 8th. This is not just mental, this is of all sources. But by age 15 to 19, it's 2nd and 3rd, and it's going to continue to be in 2nd and 3rd, 2nd to 4th, into 20 to 24 and adulthood. But this is that same inflection point. It is moving up as the source of problem. So this brings me, excuse me. This brings me to the first major point about early intervention frame in terms of actual insights, and that is Of course, we need to treat and support and help individuals at any age when they're struggling with these issues. But if we want to think strategically about impact of when we can have policies to invest in promoting positive experiences, we really want to think about this early adolescence. And it's not being 10 or 14. It is the same set of underlying developmental processes that contributed to the pubertal growth spurt, but is also affecting other learning systems. This is a precarious time when the trajectories can tip in different directions. And I think as we're learning more about not only the negative trajectories for behavioral, emotional, and mental health, and the shaping of habits, patterns, of behavior, preferences, mindsets, and early aspects of social identity, these are going to have long-term impact on health, education, economic, and social success. And as Nikki pointed out, there are earlier windows, and some of this is intergenerational. Even as we recognize the complexity of these different windows of opportunity, this is suggesting another modifiable window that where if we can help these complex multi-generational processes get on a better trajectory, we could have a bigger impact. And so this leads us to this idea that if we think of adolescence not only as this time of great vulnerability, but as windows of opportunity, it can really drive not only research and understanding how certain kinds of learning experiences lead to these spirals of problems, but also how we can intervene early in this process before it cascades. And I want to just focus on one example. It's an area we've done, we being teams of people I've been working with for more than 20 years, we've been very interested in anxiety and depression, which emerges in childhood and often worsens the anxiety often worsens in adolescence, and depression really has this surge of emergence in adolescence. And sleep plays a complex role in relation to these issues. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So sleep is not just, as I think most of you know, it's not just a process of being asleep. It is part of a really complex system of sleep and arousal regulation and circadian timing. It's as Nikki was saying, these are complex systems in the bodies and brains that are doing many, many, many different things that have to be coordinated with other kinds of behavior. And what we know is that sleep and vigilance are opponent processes. If you don't feel safe, I mean, sleep is not just resting, it is turning off your awareness and responsiveness to the world around you. That's a dangerous thing to do throughout most of human history. There's a reason most species find safe sleep sites and burrows and nests and safe sleep behaviors, because vigilance should interfere with turning off our ability to be aware of and responsive to our world around us. And kids with anxiety, kids who are in really stressful, dangerous environments, it's hard to turn off vigilance. That interferes with going to sleep. And we know that kids with clinical level impairment and anxiety disorders, they are entering adolescence with other vulnerabilities that can amplify and cause problems with their sleep. They're more vigilant, they have heightened physiological arousal, they have a predilection to worry and ruminate, particularly at bedtime. This replaying the negative events, the things that bothered you, the little mistake you made, the embarrassment, the negative thing that might happen, that when you disappointed someone, it's like putting a tongue in a toothache over and over and over again. And the more you practice it, the more automatic those negative, repetitive cognitions occur. And kids are distracted during the day with activities, but at bedtime, it's really hard not to have those bubble up. And the sensitivity to negative social evaluation. We're all sensitive to negative evaluation. We're all self-conscious. And that gets amplified in normative development in adolescence, and it is amplified by having anxiety. And these begin to spiral together. The major sources of worries and bedtime rumination in tweens is social evaluation. You have one tiny embarrassing event in 6th grade, and like you can probably still remember it now, something that happened that was a tiny little social mistake, and like it feels like a humiliation still. Why? We are so sensitized to how to learn to adjust our behavior to social norms. It's a powerful learning motivation, but it has a cost. We especially in these ages. So again, these are really complex systems. I'm not going to try to go over the details. I want to just really make some general points around how these are complex systems. And in particular, affect, and what I mean by affect here is not only emotions, but it includes arousal, and it includes the affective component of motivation. Feelings of motivation are really important. It's not just cognitive control to make yourself do things you don't want to do. When you have passionate motivations, when you feel intrinsic motivation, these are actually empowered by these affective systems. These are interacting with sleep and arousal in really complex ways. And there's been a lot of really amazing research understanding how these processes interact and how they relate to cognitive processes in the brain and neural systems in the brain. Each of these, unpacking affect is really complicated. Unpacking sleep is as well. There's the circadian, the timing of sleep, the different kinds of sleep, the continuity. Even if you could sleep 8 hours, but you had it interrupted 4 or 5 times a night, that has consequences. It's not a simple story that just improving sleep or just interfering with sleep has direct effects. It is that once you start having difficulties in the affective domain, that interferes with sleep in a variety of ways. And as sleep is disrupted, that interferes with affect. And this becomes a spiral. And there's a lot of clinical studies, really, and again, there's a huge literature on this. I'm just picking a few. We have growing evidence that sleep is a transdiagnostic risk factor, not only for anxiety and depression, but for a number of other mental disorders. We know that rumination, studies back when Susan Nolan Hoeksema was really working out aspects of this repetitive negative thinking and rumination, it is a transdiagnostic factor for depression and anxiety. And we know that rumination, this repeating negative thoughts and feelings over and over again, is a mechanism that links stressful life events to symptoms of depression and anxiety in longitudinal studies of early adolescence into adulthood. Over and over again, we see that this pattern of negative processing of emotions, anxiety, repeating negative things that have happened at bedtime interferes with going to sleep and interferes with the sleep processes. And then once your sleep is disrupted, then your emotion regulation is disrupted. And this becomes a key window into these spirals. And so and I'm oversimplifying to get the main point, that as we think about how sleep problems are transdiagnostic, and that worry and negative repetitive thoughts, rumination, is a transdiagnostic risk factor, the onset of adolescence is a period of vulnerability for all 3 of these. Young people are more likely to worry and ruminate, especially about social evaluation and fitting in, and sleep problems get worse because the circadian shift and the sleep timing makes them more vulnerable. And we've already seen that emotional disorders emerge around 10 to 13. And then finally, there's some really wonderful neuroscience work that shows that if you fall asleep thinking about negative events and feeling negative emotions, that influences how your brain processes information during sleep. Part of what we think happens in sleep is there's some extraction of gist from the day, things that you want to retain and what you want to forget. And if you fall asleep thinking and feeling about negative things, you are increasing the likelihood a negative gist will emerge. So you have even more consolidation of patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving during sleep as well as during the day. So, and again, we did some clinical studies in this work in Pittsburgh, that some of them are still going on, the longitudinal parts of this. If you take kids with clinical level anxiety disorders, social anxiety in particular, they have a high rate of sleep problems. 91% of them have clinical level difficulties with sleep. They were involved in a major cognitive behavioral therapy intervention, and we followed them through this period of time. Even after these 9 to 14-year-olds with anxiety disorders were successfully treated and no longer met clinical criteria for an anxiety disorder, 78% of them still had a sleep problem. The sleep problem didn't go away, even after the anxiety treatment. It was still a clinically elevated level of sleep difficulty. So some of my colleagues that we were working together with actually developed an intervention to target the sleep itself. And this was just a cute acronym that helped organize this 6-week approach. We were particularly focusing on thoughts, feelings, and behaviors at bedtime, including getting rid of the devices and distractions, but also not simply pushing away negative thoughts, which no one can do. That just engages the negative thoughts. You need to actively identify uplifting moments and feelings. And when you flip back to worrying, you have to have switching skills to turn back to the positive. And so this is really teaching kids the skills. Identify authentic, uplifting moments from their day. Somebody did something kind, somebody shared something. They can't make it up. They can't just pretend it's pleasant. It's got to be a real uplifting moment, and then they practice staying with it. It's like being mindful about those memories, just like you're mindful about replaying the worry, and gradually replace this. And in the meantime, we did some sort of motivational interviewing about why they would want to improve their own sleep, establishing good habits day and night, making sure the schedule didn't get off too much, and then, of course, restricting media use at night. And so this was really, really helpful, not only in the 9 to 13-year-old kids with anxiety disorders, but increasingly, and Dana McMakin, who really led this work, and she now has a whole set of studies in this area, including some of the neuroscience advantages of this, not only improving sleep, but in particular, this savoring positive, real, authentic feelings, developing those skills, and then particularly being able to do that at bedtime. So this is one small example of taking these principles of activating positive feelings that make you feel safe and make you feel good and let you lower your vigilance at a key window of time, bedtime, at a key window of development, the transition into adolescence, when you're forming these habits and when you're more vulnerable for anxiety and depression, that can alter a trajectory. It's not magic. It's not, oh, this is the answer. It's an example of targeting a window of opportunity that's been informed by our clinical understanding, informed by our scientific understanding, that can change a trajectory. So this is just one example, as I've just said, of using a developmental science framework to develop an early intervention. I could give you several other examples of teams that I've been working with, but it's illustrating here, as I just said, that we're targeting early adolescence as the window. We're targeting worry and rumination and negative cognition with these savoring and switching skills. We're targeting bedtime as a really important time. And savoring and the cognitive behavioral therapy during this adolescent risk period, in addition, not just for kids with anxiety, but kids who are at risk for having these problems, who already have these sleep problems. And this is the paper that I was mentioning earlier that really is looking at how the neuroscience insights into how cognition and emotion at bedtime is influencing sleep itself is described. So I'm going to switch gears a bit. Actually, first, before I switch gears in a major way, I want to call attention to, and there's several groups. There's a lot of groups that have been recognizing this set of issues for internalizing disorders, particularly anxiety and depression, and the importance of early adolescence. Ron Rapay's group in Australia has several really wonderful papers, and what their framework has been is that they have recognized, and this is just one example of a paper that is taking, I think, a really wonderful approach to early intervention, that there's a set of disorders, including social anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, eating disorders, and major depression that share common features. All of these disorders are associated with emotional difficulties. They're all associated with sensitivities to social evaluation. They're all more frequently occurring in females, and they all frequently co-occur with sleep problems. And so now it's not just targeting something for depression. This is thinking about a window for a whole set of disorders that are sharing features where focusing on the negative thinking and rumination, the challenges of social evaluation, especially for kids using social media and increasingly with AI, that this becomes a greater risk factor, and focusing on this ability to improve their sleep and to give them the savoring and switching skills could affect a whole set of disorders. This is just one more example from that group, this Richardson et al. Paper. Again, really beautifully done 5-year longitudinal study, looking at how the repetitive negative thinking is actually mediating the relationship between the sleep disturbance and the symptoms. And so some of the directions of these effects weren't even what we initially thought about, but they are clearly bidirectional interactions. And rather than just say, oh, well, then it's most important to focus on the negative thinking, we can target a set of related symptoms strategically and really have an impact, and especially doing it during this window of time. So again, just another example of really rigorous research supporting these sort of almost a strength-based approach to early intervention by building these positive skills and capacities. So I now want to move to the final part of this talk and say that it's almost the parallel to early intervention. But it's not about just decreasing the likelihood of the negative spiral or decreasing the development of disorders, but how do we leverage positive change? A window of opportunity for pro-social learning, for thriving, for flourishing. And I'm going to take a couple minutes to just summarize and go into a little more depth about what I was talking about earlier, about how puberty is not just causing this sudden, set of physical changes for sexual maturation, these sudden, the pubertal growth spurt. There's a large number of really elegantly done studies to pull apart what is specifically changing in neural and social processing as puberty begins to make the physical changes. And these themes I've already mentioned. The sensitivity to social rejection is clearly, that's been well studied for a very long period of time. And initially people were focusing on it simply as it's more painful to be rejected or put down or disrespected when you're in adolescence. But it turns out it is equally true for the positive. Being recognized or admired or praised is also increase in intensity. And in fact, the term salience is neutral about whether it's the positive or the negative. It's social feedback about yourself in relation to others. That's what's amplified as puberty is activated. And this has been shown in a number of studies that this attentional salience we're more likely to notice and process more deeply, and motivational salience, it's relevant to our own goals. It becomes motivationally salient for gaining social acceptance, respect, autonomy, and agency. This is really what puberty is activating. Tim Daglish's group did a really elegant study in 2017. We've done some work in this area. There's a Dutch group that's done a lot of work in this area. And this matches a lot of the psychology literature that's shown that as young people are moving into adolescence and developing with puberty, they are more sensitive to social hierarchies, they're more sensitive to status and popularity. And a study that we did at Berkeley, it's just a tiny slice, but it was fascinating because this was a task that basically looked at whether you wanted to prioritize winning money or winning the auction to have your name flashed up as the winner. And what happened is, it was in 11 to 13-year-old girls, as they began to change with puberty, they started to value reputation over money. They were willing to give up money to gain the popularity, and indicating that these systems are more sensitive to this social feedback. So what does this mean, and how do we think about this in terms of resilience? Young people are highly motivated to gain social feedback in positive ways. They want to be respected. They want to be admired. They want to get, and it is more painful to be rejected, ignored, or disrespected. This is driving learning systems. This is, young people want to find a path to get more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff. This creates, so really briefly, this gives one set of insights for school-based health programs. This was a wonderful review of how a lot of school-based health programs that would work with younger kids stop working in adolescence, in part because telling young people what they should do for their own health makes them feel diminished, less respected, and less autonomous. And just like the Truth Campaign and anti-smoking didn't tell them, don't smoke, you're going to get lung cancer, it says, you're being duped by the tobacco companies that are trying to get you addicted for profit. Standing up to big tobacco is admiring their positive health behaviors. And Chris Bryan and his team actually designed a really well done study that did the same thing. They took a pretty good healthy eating program, added a component that was not just doing it for your own health, but standing up to big sugar. And rather than being, healthy eaters are lame nerds who do what their parents, teachers, and adults tell them to do, healthy eaters are independent-minded people who stand up to the junk food industry. And they found that not only did it reduce the positive associations with junk food, it actually changed their eating patterns, and now they have follow-up data. Brian Gala did a similar approach to messaging social media use. This ability to tap into their desire to be admired has a bigger impact on behavior than telling them what they should do because adults know better. And that, again, should resonate with anyone who spends time with middle school and high school students. I want to finish up talking about a body of work that that's been really meaningful to our group. And the term mattering, it's not the emphasis on the term, it's that as we have characterized, we and others, what we mean by mattering, and there's actually two factors of mattering. One is not just wanting to be liked and appreciated and valued, but it's also wanting to be valuable. It's having your actions be valued. And it really appears that young people, the salience of mattering becomes amplified along the same lines we were talking about earlier. And if you are in a community or an environment or a family or a culture that admires pro-social behavior, if being kind and helpful and collaborative is admired, then you gain feelings of mattering through pro-social actions. If you are in an environment where only the individuals that score in the top 3% of a competitive exam really seem to matter, and other people matter a lot less, those are very, very different messages. And this idea that learning patterns can shape this natural motivation to feel valued and valuable really provides some wonderful insights into opportunities to promote healthy development, but not just for individuals, to engage young people to contribute in valued ways to their communities, to society. This is from a paper we published in 2024. It's a little heavy on the neuroscience underpinnings, and but the idea is that this is a fundamental motivation in human development that gets amplified in adolescence, wanting to feel recognized, appreciated, and capable of actions that benefit others. And we think this is really part of some shifts in these hypothalamic systems to be more sensitive to not just being valued and admired, but to contributing in valuable ways. And I'm happy to share this paper with people who are interested. And again, it's both. If you work for an organization and they say, oh, we really like you, you're really valuable, but they don't cite a single thing that you've ever done, that is not the same kind of feedback as recognizing efforts and actions. And these feedback loops, feeling recognized and appreciated for one's actions, are part of this positive spiral, particularly when it's by serving and helping others. This is fitting to a larger literature. Andrew Fellini at UCLA wrote some beautiful papers about the need to contribute in adolescence. And it is, whether it's a need or just a strong motivation, it is clear across a lot of cultures and a lot of studies that wanting to feel valued for contribution is a positive loop for individuals and societies. Young people have always been the innovators and rapid advancers of new technologies and approaches to things. This is, doing it to serve others is really fundamental. I'm just going to take one short last point here about the roots of these motivations to contribute. And it's a little bit of a nerdy tangent, but I think it's fascinating, and I'll close after this. There's actually 4 or 5 of these studies. This was the first one in 2002. This is work in hunter-gatherer societies where people are getting all of their calories from either hunting and gathering food that they can bring back and share. And what this graph is showing is age, and this is how many calories you eat versus how many calories you produce. And obviously infants don't produce they don't bring any food back. But 2 things are fascinating. The peak is out here at 40 to 50 because hunting is incredibly expertise dependent, and extractive foraging, bringing enough food back for others, the expertise is a slow curve. This is what's fascinating. Adolescents are the worst. They are total burdens, okay? They're too awkward to be contributing to real extractive foraging or hunting because they don't have the skills yet. But they're growing twice as fast. This is intergenerational transfer. If adults didn't put up with these, and again, those horrible negative stereotypes, lazy bum adolescents who can't contribute enough, our species depended on the fact of this ability not just to take care of helpless infants in the first couple years of life, but during this window where they're growing like crazy and barely bringing much food back. But this also gives us insight into why a motivation to contribute in high impact ways is really high. Because if we didn't have that, how would you get here? If you didn't develop the skills or abilities, find a niche, find a new way to fish, find some way to extract food in other ways, the motivation to contribute was essential for our species. So I'm gonna end here. I think that actually maybe I will go, I will end here that this idea that adolescents want to contribute. Yes, they want to compete, they want to stand out, but the deep incentive to feel valued and valuable creates windows of opportunity for helping young people to have opportunities to find ways to contribute, not just to succeed, not just to do well in school, not just to be effective. We want them to do those things, and deep down, the authentic feelings and in a relational way of contributing to others that they care about. Helping them do that helps them develop in healthy ways, and it helps our society to engage young people to help be contributing to some of the amazing challenges in the world we face. Thank you very much.